Everyone, this is Paris and welcome to our DMCtv panel interview. For this episode, our guest is the author of several wonderful books, Barbara Briggs Ward. Welcome to our show, Miss Ward.
Thank you, Paris. I'm so glad to be here.
We always like to learn a little about the background of our guests, so I will start things off. So, what was your childhood like?
Well, I had a very nice childhood. At the age of 7, my family and I moved out to the country, and our new house was located alongside 3 other homes that were filled with relatives. So there were 4 homes in a row, and it was all relatives out in the country. My aunts and uncles, my grandparents and cousins, and it was a great place to grow up. In the wintertime, there was a creek that ran behind the house, so we got to skate all the time. And in the summertime, we just always all got together. So it was a really wonderful place. And my grandfather's old barn, he was a farmer, but he was retired. So the barn was empty. So we got to play in the barn. So it was lots of fun. A great place to use your imagination.
Mm.
Wow, that sounded like a wonderful childhood.
Well, it was.
What family activities did you do as a child?
The one I really remember the most was in the summertime, because there were 4 homes in a row. In the summertime, when it was really nice in the evening, everybody would bring their dinners out in my grandmother's backyard. And it was a really lovely yard. It had all kinds of pine trees and picnic tables. So we would all bring our suppers out there and we would all share our supper. And then after supper, the adults would sit around and drink their coffee, and the children would play baseball and games. So that was lots of fun. That was a big memory for me.
As a child, do you do anything that showed signs of being an author later on in life?
Well, growing up in the country, my grandfather had an old chicken coop. That's where the chickens lived, but they were no longer there. The chicken coop was empty. And my parents and my aunts and uncles and my grandparents bought all the remains of an old one-room schoolhouse. Now, that was a school up the road where all the local children would go to school, but it was empty for a long time. So they bought all the desks and all the books and all the chalkboards, and they put them inside the chicken coop. And we played in there all the time. We would play there all summer long, and we used our imagination all the time. And if we weren't playing, sometimes on rainy days, we would bring my cousin Carol and I would bring books that either my grandmother or my mother had bought for me, and we would read. And that would include the Little House on the Prairie books. That would include Nancy Drew mystery stories, which were excellent. Well, they were all excellent. And a favorite author of mine was Louisa May Alcott. And she wrote Little Men and Little Women and many other of my favorite books. So if we weren't playing, a lot of the time we were reading our books. That is, if a bee didn't come in and bother us or something, or a stray animal. But it was lots of fun. And from there, sometimes I would cut little pieces of paper like little books. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I really was intrigued by books. So yes, we were very lucky to have that chicken coop, and we called it the Girls Club. And we let one of our cousin boys come in and he played too. So it was fun.
What were your interests in high school?
Well, back when I went to high school, there wasn't very much for girls to do. So I liked to go to the basketball games because my uncle was the coach. So my cousin and I would ride with him to the basketball games. And then after the games, there were dances, and I liked to dance and I love music. So that was lots of fun. But there really wasn't too much for girls back then. Way back then, there were no computers, there were no cell phones. So we really were on our own to use our imaginations and play. So in high school, if I wasn't, I really didn't like going to school. I much preferred to stay home and sit at my desk, but that was the big thing, was dances and basketball games.
Dancing too. What came after high school?
Well, after high school, back then, most of the times the girls graduated and either went into nursing or teaching, to be a teacher. But I really didn't want to do either one of those things. My mom was a nurse, and I really just had no interest. So there was a college, local college, just for girls. So I would have preferred to stay home and write my stories, but my mother made me go to this college. And it turns out I really liked it. And it was really good for me. I still lived at home, but at least I got out and met some other girls from all around the country. And I had one English professor. Oh, the college was run by nuns. Yes. And so anyway, there was a professor, a Sister Hortense. And I remember I turned in a paper and she wrote at the top of the paper, "You have a gift for writing."
Wow.
And it just kind of, I always dabbled in books, but I didn't quite understand being a writer. So I kept that with me. So that was a 2-year college. And then I went on to another college. And I'd always been intrigued by newspapers and the way they laid them out and the smell of the newspapers. So I took a course called Advertising and Design. I really had no clue what it was, but it really intrigued me and I loved it. It turned all the creative juices on and I learned a lot. And I learned that I could illustrate, which I never thought of doing. But that's what I did after high school. And it was all good.
You are a great illustrator and an author, and it's nice to know.
Well, thank you.
Tell us about your professional life.
Well, I started out in the back of my head. I had the idea that I probably wanted to write stories for grown-ups, but the idea of writing a book with chapters and trying to keep people's interest, it kind of scared me. So I started with children's books. And at that time, my oldest daughter, who was probably by then 4 or 5, she never liked to get her hair brushed. Her hair was always a mess. So for me to be able to get her to sit long enough to get her hair brushed, I made up a character called Snarly Sally. And it got so that I made all these other stories up about Snarly, and other kids would come around and listen to them. So then I eventually, I didn't think much about it, but then one day I sat down and I wondered in my head if I could draw a Snarly Sally. So one thing led to another, and I wrote a Snarly Sally story, and I had illustrations, but I didn't know what to do with it. And back then, like I said, there was nothing called a computer or Google. I couldn't look anything up. So you know where I went? I went to the library. And I sat down there for a long time. There was a room where you couldn't take the books out. It was a resource room. But I would go and I would sit on the floor and I would take notes in my notebooks. So I learned a lot about how to get a book published. The only problem was I didn't know a publisher. And I lived up in northern New York State and there were no publishers around. So by then, my daughter had grown and she lived in Colorado. And she had a friend who knew a publishing company that was looking for children's books material. So I sent my stuff off and they liked it. And so then we worked together and we came out with 2 Snarly Sally books, picture books. So that's how it started.
Hello, my name is Anya, and this is my question to you. What led up to your first book?
A lot of luck and a lot of hard work. If any of you are interested in maybe becoming a writer or thinking about it, you have to learn how to take people saying no and rejecting your material. You don't take it personal, but it might not fit into their timeline. So I did have a lot of rejections along the way. I had some encouraging words though. remember I sent an essay in about my grandmother. A magazine was doing a contest on people. You could write in and recommend people, women, for a special edition of the Ladies' Home Journal, women who represent the spirit of America. So I wrote about my grandmother, and I kind of forgot about it. And 6 months later, the phone rang, and I answered, but I was sick with the flu. And it was the magazine telling me they had chosen my essay about my grandmother was chosen as one of the ones to appear. And what they did was they sent an editor up. It was Ladies' Home Journal. They sent an editor and a photographer up to meet my grandmother. Well, I had not told my grandmother anything of what I'd done. So I went out and told her, and she was a sweet pea. She was all excited. So that was the first thing that I really I got published with. So then it just went from there, slowly, very slowly, and it's still, sometimes you wonder.
Interesting. And also earlier when you were talking about the Nancy Drew books, I have the starter set and the main set.
Oh, those are great books.
Oh,
Yeah, I love
Those
mysterious stories.
Yeah, they're really good.
timeless.
Yes, definitely. And the
Rob?
Black Star-
What was your process in publishing your first book?
Well, after a real publisher was interested, we got talking more, and they realized that I like to illustrate. So they asked me to do some illustrations. So I ran up again to the library to see how to present this to a publisher. So after spending quite a bit of time illustrating, I mailed them some ideas about Snarly Sally. And so we went back and forth, and then finally we agreed upon a layout of the books. A picture book is usually 32 pages. So there's a certain way to lay it out. So I laid it out, and they liked it. So that was how it started. And then we had a deal for 2 books. So the second was a rhyming ABC book. So we lacked enough material for 2 more pages. So I designed a page at the end of the book that would ask the children questions about going back into the story. So it would get them more into the story again, but then it would fill out the 32 pages. So that's how that happened. So it was a process, a good one.
It's
Carrie?
interesting to know that. How would you describe your style of writing?
Well, like I said, I started out with the picture books for the boys and girls, but I had this little thing in the back of my head that I really would like to try to write for adults. But I would tell myself, no, you can't do that. You couldn't take an idea and go from the beginning to the end and get interest, get people long enough to read your story. But one day, I love snow. That's why my books usually have snow in them. I love snow and I love winter. So one day I was looking out a window, and it was snowing, these big, beautiful snowflakes. And all of a sudden, in my head, in my imagination, I pictured my grandfather's old barn. Now, we played in that old barn all the time, my cousins and I. It was empty by then because he'd sold the farm, but we were allowed to play in there. So I had this imagination that there's something going on inside that barn, and I have to write about it. So I sat down, and I'm telling you, this story just came pouring out of me. I couldn't keep up with the words. And I tell everybody later that the characters really wrote that story. So that was my first book, and I called it The Reindeer Keeper. It's an adult story for adults, but I have a 12-year-old, I have a granddaughter who's 12, and her best friend is 12, and she's read all my books that I geared towards adults, and she loves them. So, you know, it would be okay for 11, 12 years old. So I've gotten a lot of good feedback from that age too. But that was my first one. When the idea hit, I couldn't stop it. And it's worse when it doesn't hit. And you sit there
What
Sure.
were the steps in writing a book?
Well, obviously, you know, you have to have the idea, right? You have to have the idea, and every writer has a different process. Mine is, I had that image with the reindeer keeper. Usually, if I get the title in my head, then in my head I can start writing. I don't plot it out, because to me it hinders me. I like to sit down and let the characters take it and let it unfold. But a lot of other people do it different ways. So I just sit down and I can feel if I'm at the spot where I should be to write the story. And excuse me, sometimes at night it's just hard to stop it because the process just takes you away. So every writer has their own way. Some break it up into chapters, but I never found I could do that because I really didn't know where I was going. The characters are the one who decide that. Everybody's different. So if you want to be a writer, you just kind of let it flow. You'll feel it. You'll feel it in you if you're at that spot.
That's a great answer.
Where
Caitlin?
do you find your inspiration for your books?
Everywhere. That's my problem. I live out in the country, and it's a beautiful area of the country. Canada, if I looked out my front window, I can see Canada. And there are many farms where I live, and many of them are Amish farms. And my son and I drive around the back roads all the time, and we go to the Amish farms. And there's so much richness about these Amish farms that I get from visiting them. And I go by old farms and all the Amish schools, especially when they're getting out of school. There's just so much inspiration, and I love it because there are 4 seasons where I live, and every season I just love, mostly winter, most, and fall. But some people come up to me and say, "Oh, where do you get your ideas? I just can't think of any." And my problem is you get so many. I think if you just relax and go out and enjoy what's around you, you know, the moon, we're really blessed with what we have. So I just look around and I feel very lucky, and luckily the ideas come.
Tell us about your latest book.
The name of the latest book is for adults or 11 or 12-year-olds and up. It's called Velvet Snowflakes. It's a story about a young woman who moves away, and she becomes a excuse me, she becomes a very famous wedding gown designer. But something pulls her back home. She doesn't know what it is, and she goes back home before Christmas one year, and she reconnects with 3 people who she wants to thank for helping her. She had a hard childhood. Her parents divorced, and they had to move out of their home, and she never really got to say goodbye to her home, and it's always been a sad spot with her. So she goes back, and next door there was an older man, and he was always very kind to her and her younger sister. So she goes back, and he was a veterinarian, and he had a little barn behind his house where the animals were. So she used to go over there all the time, but she has no clue if he's alive or not. She has no clue, but something is drawing her back home. So it was taking this young woman who became very successful, but something was calling her back home. So she goes back to find 3 people she credited for helping her along the way. So that's the basics, but I don't want to tell you anymore.
I hope she can meet all of them and say thank you.
Go ahead, Perry.
How do you develop your characters in this book? And
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Perry.
develop your characters in this book and other books?
Okay, how do I develop them?
Yes.
Okay, I have an idea in my head of what they look like. But once I decide on their name, which is the fun part, once I pick a name for them, and then I have a storyline, and then they develop all on their own. And once I write, like I've said before, they kind of take over. But I imagine them in my head. And honestly, it might sound silly, but really they become my best friends.
Wow.
Like I know them.
What message do you want people to receive from this book?
Well, I write about real life, about what we all experience in life, you know, happiness and sadness and joyfulness and loss and wonder. I write about life so everybody can connect with what a character is going through. I just like to inspire people, and when they end reading a book, that they have had a really good experience reading the book. I think the world is tough enough, and there's enough sadness around the world that if I can offer a bit of satisfaction or happiness or an escape for a while, then my characters have done their job. So there's no horrible scenes. They're just nice family-oriented books, although they have their problems, but make it through.
Who promoted your books?
Well, the publisher does some of that, and I now that we have the computer and the and all the outlets on the computer, I do a lot online. I use Facebook and all the other places that you can go. And I also, being a background in print media, which is like newspapers and magazines, I put ads in like Yankee magazine, because the character of Yankee magazine and my books, I feel, kind of go together. And I have I live near the Adirondack Mountains, and they have a very nice magazine. So I do a lot of that, and I do some book signings around here. And then they're always on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all those places. So, you know, and I do a lot of book clubs online. So with the internet, it's a really great source to get the word out. So that's what I do.
So I have one more question. Are there characters in your books who inspire by people you know?
Yes, definitely. Well, in fact, in this new book, Velvet Snowflakes, my father's name was Walter. My father was a gentle soul, and in the story, I introduced an older reindeer. And for some reason, I'm up one night introducing the reindeer, and I named him Walter. So the reindeer is named Walter, and I was thinking of my father when I named that. But yes, my grandmother inspired me a lot, and she's in a few characters in another book I have called The Snowman Maker. And there are other relatives I have who had influenced me that way, that have found their way onto the books. I'm the only one who knows it, though, except for Walter the reindeer. My father would have loved that.
If people would like to buy a copy of the book and follow your activities, what can they do?
Well, as I mentioned, you can go to Amazon, and you can go to Barnes and Noble online, and go to my website, barbarabriggsward.com. At the moment, only the recent book is available to buy, but you can read about me on there. And I have a blog on there, which you might find interesting. And you can contact me, and I'd be glad to send you a personal book if you'd like. So they're all over the internet. Thank goodness. And they're in libraries. I can't stress enough the value of a library.
Oh, yeah. We're going to
yeah.
start round 3, and Perry, this is the round of questions that students, just based on what they're listening to, are going to come up with their own questions for you. So I'll turn it over to you, Perry, and you can take and kick off round 3.
So this is my question to you. How will you encourage kids like me to become an author? What advice would you give to us?
If you wanted to become an author,
Yes.
okay. Well, I always have had with me ever since I would go to the chicken coop. I usually would always have a notebook with me, because if some idea hits me, I need to write it down or I'll forget it. So I always make sure I have some kind of paper and pen with me. Of course, now people use their phone, but I still use my notebooks. Read a lot. You get awesome ideas just by reading. Spend some time in the library or try to get in a little reading group. And then just sit down and see what happens. And start your stories. You'd be surprised where your storyline will take you, and let it flow. Let the story come out. And one most important thing I was going to add, my grandfather one year for Christmas made me a desk. And I found once I had that desk, that was my center point. I loved a desk. So if you have a desk, it's a great place to sit and create. So that was my most favorite thing that I ever received for Christmas. So you just sit down and start. I call it scribble. I always start, I use my computer now, obviously, to write, but I always start scribbling in a notebook, because once you start to scribble, then your mind starts to work even faster. So that's just how I do it. Thank you for the question.
What is your favorite book written by you?
Oh boy. Well, that's a tough one. Thank you, sir. They all have different little messages. I think maybe The Reindeer Keeper. That was the first book I wrote for older boys and girls or for adults. That was the one where the barn, my grandfather's barn, came to mind. And it just, I can't tell you how quickly I wrote that book. And it's the one I get most remarks about, but they're all special to me, and all the characters I love. But that one probably is a little more special, probably because it was the first.
Caitlin?
I have another one.
Okay, go ahead.
Who is your favorite author than you?
Other than yourself.
Other than me. Well, of all the ones I still have to go back to my childhood, and Louisa May Alcott. I just love her. And they made a movie out of Little Women. That was just recent. And her books are special to me. I don't know if that's because they were like one of the first ones I read. But Louisa May Alcott, if you look her up, she has some great, great books.
Caitlin?
Do you do author readings in the library?
Yes, I just did one a few weeks ago. Yes, we're lucky where I live. We have a lot of little local libraries. So yes, and it's fun to meet the children and to get to answer all their questions like tonight. So I do.
Why do you enjoy writing, and what drives you to do it?
I enjoy writing. It's inspiring, it's creative. It can take you in your mind to places that maybe you've never been, but you can go there and visit. I like to write stories and make people feel good, and to give them a place to go for a few hours. It's something that I can't imagine not doing. And my problem is you just get so many ideas that you really have to zone a lot of them out and sit down and write them. But I so enjoy my stories, and when somebody tells me they enjoyed reading it really spurs me on to keep writing. So I love it.
I have another question. How has digital media changed the world of publishing?
Well, there are a lot of authors now, and it's made it easier to happen. And sometimes people rush to get it done, and you have to make sure that you don't skip on quality. You know, you have to make sure that your books are really edited and there's no spelling and grammar mistakes. And that's very, very important to make it look professional. And it's so much easier now to reach people. I mean, I have people contacting me from, you know, across this country, but across the world, you know, people that I never would have met, or they never would have read my books before. And it's a great way to reach people that you never would have met before. And some of them, you know, I hear from quite a bit, and they're very, very supportive. And I've never met them, but I feel like I have. Thank you, sir.
Are your books nonfiction or fiction?
They're fiction. Mhm.
Okay, and one more question. How do you get books from Amazon?
Well, you just go on Amazon, and you would look me up, Barbara Briggs Ward, and then they would show my list of books.
I think it was, how do you get books on Amazon? What's the process of you getting books on it?
Okay.
Never mind.
My publisher does that.
Okay.
That's one thing I don't have to do.
And are you currently working on a new book?
Yes, I am. I don't have the title yet. I have it mulling around in my head. In fact, I started this story a few years ago, and I got to a stone wall and I quit it. But in fact, I just went back to it the other night. So I've made some changes and now I like it, but I have to get my title.
That's so interesting.
What inspired you to be an author?
Why did I?
What inspired you to be an author?
Just reading books, sitting in my chicken coop, you know, reading books, and I like the process of actually writing. So, and sitting at my desk, I always wanted to be a writer. I just didn't realize it until that nun told me I had a gift for writing.
Mm.
I knew there was something there.
Okay, Perry?
If people would like to learn more and follow your activities, what can they do?
What can we do?
If someone wants to follow your activities and
Oh. Okay, well, you could go to my website, or I don't know if you're on Facebook, but Barbara Briggs Ward, I'm on Facebook, and I do a lot of little writing stuff, and I love to take photos because of where we live. So it's very child friendly, and I like to read and write. And on my excuse me, on my website, there's a blog, and you can read about me growing up, and so you can even see somewhere in there I have a picture of my old clubhouse. So you'll get to know me a little more if you go there and read my blog.
all right.
I'm sure you could come to where you live, because I bet it is beautiful.
Oh, it is, especially now. Well, the leaves have all gone.
Mm.
So now we're kind of waiting for some snow to come. It was quite chilly today, but it's beautiful, you know, the four
Okay.
seasons.
Well, thank you for being our guest today. And I would like to thank all our viewers. Please consider liking and sharing this episode. This is Perry reporting for Digital Media Clip TV.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody say thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
you.